All right, so what I've done is I've asked ChatGPT to give me 3 highly debated topics that are floating around right now on the internet regarding health and fitness and nutrition. Because let's face it, there's a lot of information out there, and when there's a lot of information, it tends to create a lot of confusion because a lot of it is conflicting. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you some of my insights, some of my thoughts on some of these topics, and do what you will with them. But I just want to be clear, the way that I kind of look at this thing, I look at health and fitness and nutrition as a specific way to build the healthiest body that you can possibly build. It's not about just aesthetics. It's not about just any one thing. It's about how healthy can we make you. So maybe a little bit different than what I believe that the large majority of the fitness industry is designed to do, which is really just make you look a certain way. There's so much more than that. I think we need to go much, much deeper. So with that being said, let's talk about what is topic number 1. And topic number 1 is the optimal training frequency for building muscle. All right, so optimal training frequency, and it talks a little bit about should we be training each muscle group once a week, kind of like the old school bodybuilder bro split, or should maybe we be doing something like upper, lower, push-pull legs, all these things. What this is referencing is really kind of all just bodybuilding kind of stuff, right? So my thinking is if we want to build a healthy body, right? If we want a body that is super healthy, it needs to perform very well in everyday life, right? Like that's just it's kind of a non-negotiable. And as a guy over 40, like I'm 49 years old, I'm going to be 50 in a couple of months. The most important thing for me is not how big my muscles are. The most important thing for me is that I'm fully functionally capable in everything that I do. So muscle tissue, when I'm trying to build muscle tissue, I think it's important, but even more important is, again, just functional capability, right? And part of having a very functionally capable body is being strong. Now, a lot of the research out there right now is showing look how important it is to have muscle tissue, right? If you have more muscle tissue, you're going to live longer. Basically, that's what the research shows. There's something to that. But if that was all it was, then why wouldn't we just put everyone on steroids or everyone on testosterone replacement therapy, right? Just to make people as big as we possibly could so that they could live longer. I think we all sort of know that that's probably not the right way to approach this thing. So is there something a little bit more valuable here than just building muscle, right? And I already alluded to the first thing, which is we want to stay highly functional. But secondly, we want to be strong. It's one thing to have big muscles. It's another thing to be very strong. And you might be thinking, well, those are sort of correlated, right? And the truth is they are correlated. But what I found in my experience is there are a lot of really big guys who have really big muscles who are not very strong. Like I know guys who are, 220 pounds. They're much bigger than I am. I'm about 160 pounds. I don't have big muscles. And I can outlift in some things a lot of the guys that are much, much bigger than me. So how can that be? Part of it is just training, right? It's I get more out of the size of the muscle that I have than maybe to someone who's much, much bigger. And again, if somebody sort of artificially inflates the size of their muscles through the use of testosterone or through the use of steroids, things like that, it doesn't always translate into strength. And you would think it would, but it doesn't, right? Now, for the record, someone who's well-trained and bigger than I am and has bigger muscles is going to be stronger. But someone who's a little bit smaller and very well-trained tends to be I have a lot of examples of small people and women included. There's a lot of women who are way stronger than guys, just because they're very, very well trained. So it's not all about muscle size, but I think the fitness industry kind of has us on this pursuit, especially as men, to get as big as possible. Right? We're the magazines are showing these guys that are just giant and jacked, but is that healthy? That's the lens that I'm always looking at all of these debates from is this really a healthy endeavor? Because if we're just chasing muscle size, that's a very, very unhealthy thing. So going back to the original question, should we be doing bro splits? Should we be doing more full body workouts? Again, if we go back to just we want functional capability, the answer is you work your entire body as often as possible, toenails to fingernails, right? To do bodybuilding style stuff, and let me just give you an example, to spend a half an hour doing bicep work is not going to be as conducive to your functional capabilities or to your full body strength. it just doesn't work. It might be a way to really beat up a muscle, and maybe it's going to grow a little bit more. But I think if you really dig into some of the research, the most impactful thing when it comes to creating muscle size, there's a couple of things, but one of them is time under tension. So we just want to put muscles under tension. But if I can put my whole body under tension, like doing squats or deadlifts or pull-ups or standing overhead presses, like we're stressing the entire body, toenails to fingernails, that's going to elicit a far more powerful benefit as far as muscle building goes. Okay. And the other thing we have to look at is there's a couple other things, right? So number one is time under tension. And I want to put time under tension on the whole body. The second thing we want to look at is nutrition. What are you putting in your body? Because you could be training, you could have the best training program in the world. You could be spending lots of time under tension, working on all your functional capabilities, building your strength, all that stuff, but you may not get any bigger if you're not eating the right foods or if you're not eating enough of the right foods, right? So a lot of people, they kind of fall into this trap where they want to gain muscle, but they also want to lose body fat. And that can be a little bit of a slippery slope, because if you cut your calories too much, or if you reduce the amount of food that you're eating, you might get smaller, and you might even sacrifice muscle size if you're restricting too much, right? So what I've found is if you want to build muscle tissue and lose body fat at the same time, which can be done, at least in my experience, I've seen it happen many, many times, you want to make sure that you're eating an abundance of high quality foods. That's the key, right? So when I say in abundance, I'm even going to go as far as to say, and again, this is from my experience, to eat maybe not in any sort of calorie deficit, but even eating above what your daily caloric requirement should be. Right. So if you have a sense of like how many calories you should be eating in a day to sustain your life, and then usually subtract 10% or whatever, right, to lose weight, I'm saying actually add food, actually add some calories. The kind of the thinking around this calories in, calories out model is we assume that any excess number of calories is automatically going to get put into body fat. And what I found is that that's not always the case. If you're someone who's lifting weights and you're doing it the right way, you're putting yourself under enough time under tension, then that excess calories may not go to body fat. It may go into rebuilding that muscle tissue, right? But you have to make sure you're sending the signals to say, hey, we got to rebuild this muscle, right? So you have to do strength training so that the excess calories goes into there instead of into body fat, right? Like if you have two kind of buckets, you've got the body fat cells, right, which are like little balloons, and then you get your muscle cells, which can actually grow, right? Where do you want those excess calories going? Do you want it going over here? If you don't exercise and you sit on your butt all the time, they're going to go over here, right? But if you're training, then those extra calories might go over here to actually rebuild that tissue, right? So there's my thinking. And you can lose body fat and you can gain muscle tissue by eating in an excess. I've seen it happen over and over again. And the other beautiful thing about that is you never get tired and hungry and feel crappy. But again, it's really important to make sure that you're eating the right food, which brings me into kind of this next thing. So 3 things: time under tension. Number 2 is eating enough food, high quality food. And then the third thing is hormones. So obviously like testosterone, we'll just say that's the big one, right? So testosterone, growth hormone, insulin growth factor, like there's a lot of different hormones in the body. There's so many, right? It's so complicated that I would argue that nobody really has it fully figured out. So there's a lot of hormones in the body, but if we signal the right hormones, it's going to sort of push that excess into the rebuilding of muscle tissue, right? So if you have the right hormonal milieu, if you will, like kind of the right cocktail, the right mixture going through your body, that's how we can force the body to go in either body fat direction or muscle tissue regeneration, right? So how do you affect your tissue? Again, your hormones, time under tension, like do some resistance training, like lift some heavy things. Like it's so important for you to lift heavy stuff and to load that body, because it's going to change that hormonal milieu. It's going to change that cocktail to promote building as opposed to storage, right? So hopefully that makes sense. Again, I'm all for build full body strength, do big compound movements. Primarily, I wouldn't even get into the bodybuilding stuff where you're isolating different muscle groups. I think it's a waste of time. and then make sure you're eating enough. And if you're lifting heavy enough, don't be afraid to lift heavy, but make sure you know what you're doing. But don't be afraid to lift heavy because that's what changes that hormonal sort of cocktail. Okay, so let's move on. The second thing we've got is flexible diet versus strict meal plans. So usually if someone gets into a diet, there's a couple of different kinds of folks out there. Let me just start there. So let's just say two buckets of people. There are some people who really like the rigidity of a very strict diet. Like they like the very clear boundaries, and it works very well for them. The problem with the very strict diet is it's very unsustainable. So even though there's a lot of people out there that kind of like those boundaries, it becomes something that becomes more and more challenging over time. I can't think of a single person, and I've been doing this for 25 years. I've been in the health, fitness, nutrition space for 25 years. I can't think of a single person that has followed a strict diet for any longer than, let's just say, 3 years. And 3 years is a stretch, right? Like that person was extremely type A. So with that being said, I think we automatically need to really start thinking about being more flexible, just from a sustainability standpoint. Like if you're in this for the long game, which I think you should be, then you should be thinking about strategies to make this very flexible, right? The goal is not to be perfect. The goal with nutrition is to make more good decisions than bad decisions. And maybe even beyond nutrition, right? We always want to make more good decisions than bad decisions, just in life in general, right? But we're going to make mistakes, and to be okay with making some mistakes. And there's a lot of talk about like sort of an 80-20 rule. Like you want to make 80% good decisions and 20% of indiscretion, which is a model that we use in my coaching program, Athletic After 40, that we use for nutrition. Like we want to be 80% of the time, make great choices. And if you stretch that out over years, decades, that makes a massive difference in the way that you look, the way that you feel, the way that you perform, the overall health of your body and all the systems in your body, right? Like if you can really kind of build the habits around being 80% good, you're going to be so far ahead of what most people are doing right now. So there's my thinking on flexible diet versus strict meal plans. There might be a time and a place for strict meal plans. And I'll just give you an example. Like if you're bordering on type 2 diabetes, or maybe you got diagnosed with type 2 diabetes, that might be a time where we use like a really strict meal plan. Maybe we go on keto for 6 to 8 weeks, something like that, where there's really tight guardrails, really, really restrictive. But we would use it as more of a therapy as opposed to just like a lifestyle, right? There's two completely different things, because that therapy might get you out of type 2 diabetes, where then you can start to build the habits of something that's a little bit more flexible. Right. So again, not to completely poo-poo strict meal plans. I think there might be a time and a place for it, but I would consider them to be more therapies as opposed to lifestyles. All right. So let's talk about number 3 here. The role of mobility and flexibility in strength training. So growing up, I'm again 49, I'll be 50 in a little bit here. Growing up, stretching was a big part of gym class, and we were taught to stretch, right? Before you exercise, you should always stretch. And stretching usually was like getting into a certain position and then holding the position. And the thinking was like, if we got into let's just use the toe, touching your toes as an example. If I'm standing here and I keep my legs straight and I reach down and I try to touch my toes, but I can't, right? Because I'm restricted through the back of my body. If I hang out there long enough, I might be able to get down just a little bit lower, right? But the thing with static stretching is there's not a lot of benefit in it for the long game, and it's not great for improving your ability to move, right? At the end of the day, flexibility is designed to help you to move less restricted. So how do you develop flexibility in a way that's going to allow you to move better? It's not standing there and trying to touch your toes and hanging out in that position for a long time. It's actually doing the movement, right? So let's use a squat as an example. If I squat down and I just feel really tight, right? Like my back feels tight, my hips feel tight, my quad, like everything just kind of feels tight. What generally is going on here is not that the muscles are like full of this scar tissue and it's all locked down. I mean, maybe if you've had a lot of surgeries or injuries, that could be the case. But for most people, that's not it. Usually, the lack of mobility is due to some neuromuscular components, meaning when you go down into a squat, if you're not used to doing that, and if you never really train that or practice that, your nervous system gets a little freaked out as you start to go into some of these angles, right? The lower you squat down, your brain sends messages through the nerves that innervate with those muscles, and they say, hold on, hit the brakes. What is this guy doing? We haven't really done this before. Hit the brakes. And then you get kind of wound up and tight. And you can't even get into a good position. It feels really uncomfortable. So you have to retrain your nervous system to be able to access those ranges of motion. You have to sort of shut down the nervous system so that it's not so protective because it's so worried that you're going to hurt yourself if you've never done it before, right? So you have to kind of find different ways of progressing through these big compound movements where you feel tight, and you have to start retraining your nervous system. I'm going to make a claim here that may not be backed by science, but I think it's really important because this is something I've experienced over and over and over and over again. Most people, when they come to me and they tell me all of the tightnesses that they have, and I spend, let's say, 15 minutes with them working on just a simple air squat, yeah, the first few squats look terrible and they look really tight and restricted. But once I start to cue them and I start to give them different signals, they start to find better positions. And in 15 minutes, I can get someone who feels as tight as can be to squat down to full depth and stand back up with very little restriction. So again, that's just a testament to say that a lot of it is just nervous system. Like, you just don't have the skill. You have to develop the skill. So I think if you want better mobility, a couple things here. Number one, you have to practice the skills, but then what are the skills that you need to practice, right? Like, what are the real world mobility skills? And let me just give you an example. For a lot of people, especially in like the yoga, Pilates community, there's kind of a thinking, and this is just a broad statement, this is not for everybody, but I find that a lot of these folks, more is better, right? Like, if you can get into a full back bend, doing the splits, more is always better, but that's not necessarily the case. We don't want to create so much mobility through a joint that it becomes almost like a circus trick. Because if we try to create too much mobility, too much flexibility in a joint, we can give up the integrity of that joint, right? So we lose some structural integrity based on how much mobility is there. So we have to make sure that we're practicing ranges of motion that carry over really well into everyday life. And what are those things? You have to be able to squat down, like full deep squat below parallel, and then stand yourself back up. You need to be able to safely lean over, pick something up from the floor and stand back up with it, right? And not with a straight leg, because you never see that in the real world. That's only in the world of exercise. It's a weird thing. You need to be able to push something up over your head, right? And open up the shoulders. You need to be able to pull yourself up onto something, right? You need to be able to rotate left to right, right? So there's a lot of different fundamental movement patterns. Those are the things that you need to work on. Don't worry about some of the extreme ends of things. If you go to a yoga class, don't worry about doing the splits. Don't worry about getting into a full back bend. Those things are not beneficial for most people. Unless you're a gymnast or a cheerleader or something, there's very little value to some of those things. In fact, they may hurt you more than they may help you. So again, going back to this, the role of mobility and flexibility in strength training, learn beautiful movements, learn biomechanics, understand how to organize your body to be able to move really, really well, right? And a lot of that is just skills. It's coordination, balance, right? It's just being able, agility. It's these skills that you have to learn. And the more you practice it, you'll be shocked to see that you don't need to spend a bunch of time stretching. Right? There are certain times, in certain places, there's tools for different jobs, and everybody's got little different things. But again, there's some nuance to it, but most of the time, it's just learn the skill. So there you have it. Those are the 3 things that I want to cover today from ChatGPT. Hopefully this was valuable for you. If there's a topic that you want me to cover or discuss, make sure that you comment below, and I will take a look at those, and I will shoot a video with your suggestions. All right. Hope you have a great day, and happy training.